Hello, tonight we're going to talk about the early Earth and the origin of life. The Earth formed about 4.6 billion years ago. It formed from a collection of dust and debris from outer space, and they all coalesced into a ball. When the Earth was still very young, a very large Mars-sized object collided with the Earth. And when it did, it threw up a ton of debris from the Earth's surface, and that material then formed the moon. So that's kind of how the moon formed, and that's how the Earth formed. It took a long time, several billion years, almost 2.5 billion years, before life actually evolved. During that time, that's when all the dust and debris were collecting, forming the Earth. But once we had the Earth, the question becomes, how did life start? And honestly, no one really knows. When the Earth was forming, comets would land on the Earth bringing water. Can you imagine how many comets would have had to land to fill the oceans with water? It's unbelievable, but that's kind of how it happened. Well, so they don't really know exactly how the Earth formed. But what they do know is that if you take chemicals that they think were around when the Earth was very young, they automatically realign and form small pieces of DNA and small pieces of RNA. They form lipids, which, if you remember, phospholipids, are the major component of cell membranes. Those form automatically. Because of the hydrophobic, hydrophilic ends, they align themselves into little tiny microspheres, which is a cell membrane. There's nothing inside it, but they form themselves that way. And all 20 of the amino acids form, all 20 of the amino acids form, and all of the nucleic acids, all 5 of them, adenine, cytosine, thymine, guanine, and uracil. So all of those things form automatically. But it doesn't mean it forms life. So how do we know that? Well, some scientists down here, Oprah and Haldane and Miller, worked together in the 1950s. And what they did is they took these chemicals listed there, and they combined them into a giant sphere. And then they added electricity to that sphere. And within hours, the inside of the sphere coalesces and forms this brown slime. And that's pretty much what they think the oceans were filled with, this brown slime. And in that brown slime, you find all of those molecules I just listed. Now, if you let that brown slime sit there for 1 billion years or more, the likelihood of one of those little microbubbles forming around a piece of DNA is fairly great. And really, honestly, that's all a bacteria is. It's a piece of DNA stuck inside a phospholipid membrane. Having a piece of DNA that actually codes for something, genes, things like that, would have taken, 2.5 billion years. It took a long time for that to happen. That's nothing we can make happen in a laboratory, but you can see how it could have happened. And so the scientists in the late 50s got credit for discovering that. They also discovered that DNA and RNA are the only molecules in the entire universe which can replicate themselves. Bacteria don't have the DNA polymerase and other molecules that we need for DNA replication, and yet they're able to replicate their DNA. And DNA just in that big glass ball was able to replicate itself. It's kind of a unique situation, but nothing else. No other molecule can make copies of itself. You can't have a piece of salt make copies of itself, or a piece of a protein make copies of itself. It doesn't happen. But DNA and RNA can, and that is totally unique. It's interesting, and when we look at samples from outer space, from comets and meteors, On the rocks, there are actually samples of nucleic acids, small pieces of DNA and RNA on the rocks in outer space, because those things are so easy to make. Making something alive is very difficult. I can't stress that enough. Okay, so what we can create and what created were these protobionts, which were the precursors of cells. They were just a little lipid bubble with a piece of DNA inside. Kind of interesting. Also, things called microspheres and coacerates, which are protobionts that actually have a phospholipid membrane that is permeable. Well, somewhere along the line, life finally evolved, and they don't know exactly when, but we do have a fossilized bacteria that's over 3 billion years old. So sometime then or before then, how in the world did they find a fossilized bacteria? But they did. Wow, that's amazing. But sometime between 4 and 3.5 billion years ago, they think life originated. About 2.1 billion years ago, there was a massive global change. And what happened was that oxygen was accumulating in the atmosphere to such extent that the iron, which was very prevalent, most of our crust is made of iron, the iron started to rust. And rust accumulated on the bottom of the ocean floors by the tons. Well, how do you get oxygen accumulating? What process do organisms go through that produces oxygen? Okay, it's on the slide. Yeah, photosynthesis. They have to go through photosynthesis, which means the first bacteria that became photosynthetic evolved sometime before 2.1 billion years ago, when we finally have enough oxygen causing the rust to form. They don't know exactly where the first original life formed, but they think they probably originated around these deep sea vents, which are these, let's see, I thought I had a slide here, which are these volcanic vents deep in the ocean. Right now we have some bacteria that thrive there and no place else in the world, and they're kind of unique bacteria. So it's probably where it originated. Okay. That organic material that first evolved, it's called an organic soup. What they think probably happened when the first bacteria that evolved, before they became photosynthetic, what they would do is they would compete with each other to eat the organic molecules that were being created in the oceans. And so there was natural selection going on. The bacteria that were faster and could find those organic molecules better ate, reproduced more successfully, and outcompeted the ones that didn't. And so you had some selection going on. Then the bacteria that did evolve, that could make their own food, basically the photosynthetic bacteria, had a distinct advantage and were able to outcompete, in a way, the bacteria that didn't, that had to find their own food sources. So there was a definite advantage. Like I said, they think they probably evolved around these deep sea vents. This is a deep sea vent. And around these vents, you have superheated water that comes out, but in that water are rich nutrients, nitrogen and sulfur specifically, from the volcano. Well, the bacteria take the sulfur and they use that instead of going through photosynthesis. They go through chemosynthesis, which is taking the sulfur and doing the same thing as creating the energy instead of going through photosynthesis. And so those bacteria didn't have to search for food, but could take the chemicals that were rich in the water and then use them to go through chemosynthesis. So that's kind of a really unique group of bacteria still alive today, and they think that they've been alive for billions of years. Well, after we had bacteria around for a long time, one of the things that they think happened, which was really important was that the Earth's surface froze from pole to pole. It's the only time in the Earth's history that they think this probably happened. But during this time, we went from prokaryotic cells to eukaryotic cells. So we're going to watch this YouTube video that's going to describe this.
"8:27 p.m. on our clock of the Earth's history, 650 million years ago. The planet faced climate disaster. A global deep freeze. But what made it happen? Snowball Earth wasn't the first time the Earth had frozen, and it wouldn't be the last. Our planet goes through an ice age about once every 100,000 years. Most of them are caused by changes in our orbit. The further away from the sun we go, the colder it gets. At the height of the last ice age, ice sheets covered around a third of the planet, and all of this would have been buried under hundreds of feet of ice. But factors like orbit and rotation aren't enough to explain ice stretching right down to the equator. That must have taken something far more dramatic. The smoking gun turned out to be our atmosphere. Specifically, greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide.
A greenhouse gas is any kind of gas which has the capacity to convert the sun's rays into heat, making this planet the warm planet that it is today.
But it's a delicate balancing act. If CO2 levels grow too high or too low, the climate spirals into chaos. Too much carbon dioxide and the planet warms, too little and it cools.
Carbon dioxide is a very important gas. It's both our dilemma and our solution when it's there in too great a proportion that overheats the Earth, which of course we're worried about today. However, in the time leading up to Snowball Earth, we had the opposite problem. There wasn't enough carbon dioxide, and the Earth began to cool to a point where there was a runaway refrigeration that locked this Earth up in an icy crust.
Gehling believes that a drop in carbon dioxide levels caused the Snowball Earth disaster. Something was removing the CO2 from the atmosphere on a huge scale. And there's only one process capable of doing that: weathering. Carbon dioxide mixes with water vapor to form acid rain. The acid reacts with the rocks it falls on to form new carbon chemicals in the water. It then washes down to the sea, where it helps form solid limestone. Carbon dioxide that was once in the atmosphere is locked away on the ocean floor.
When weathering occurs at a great rate, you strip away rocks with acid rain, and that takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and makes sure that it's locked away in the ocean.
Weathering happens more quickly when it's hot and humid. Normally, at least some of the Earth's land masses are too far north or south for weathering to be a major factor. But 650 million years ago, all the Earth's land masses from Death Valley to Australia were clumped together into one big supercontinent at the equator. The weathering process went into overdrive. CO2 levels crashed, and so did the Earth's temperature.
You have carbon dioxide being taken out and not replaced, and as a result, the Earth inevitably has to cool until you have a snowball.
Today, plants and animals help balance the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Plants absorb it, animals breathe it out. But 650 million years ago, the only life forms on Earth were single-celled bacteria in the oceans. And they were actually making the situation worse.
650 million years ago, this is a world of cyanobacteria. Bacteria that formed a slime layer on the seafloor. Cyanobacteria are tiny organisms that have been around on this planet for 3 billion years before Snowball Earth. But at this time, they were particularly important.
These cyanobacteria sucked even more carbon dioxide from the oceans and locked it into limestone reefs called stromatolites. Some of this ancient carbon dioxide is still trapped in fossilized reefs, like these in Flinders Ranges in southern Australia. When Jim Gehling pours a weak acid onto them, the carbon dioxide they locked away hundreds of millions of years ago fizzes out.
What you'll see is an effervescence. Those white bubbles are carbon dioxide that have been locked up in these stromatolites, being released back into the atmosphere.
Rather than stabilizing the carbon dioxide levels, the cyanobacteria were depleting them further. In combination with weathering, they sucked the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and temperatures plummeted. Even then the planet might have avoided a total freeze, until a catastrophic chain reaction pushed it to the point of no return. Seconds past 8:27 p.m. on our clock of Earth's history. Snowball Earth, 650 million years ago, and counting. Ice was creeping down from the poles. In a normal ice age, at some point it would have stopped, but this wasn't normal. The ice just kept on coming, until eventually it reached a point of no return. As it did, it triggered a phenomenon that would push life to the limit. The Earth's surface is made up of land, open ocean and ice. These surfaces all reflect sunlight differently, and that's the key to what happened next. This is the Arctic Ocean, at the point where the ice meets open water. Scientists call it the lead edge. And geophysicist Don Perovich is here to study how the ancient Earth tipped over into a catastrophic deep freeze.
This is the place where the ice that's frozen to the shore meets the open Arctic Ocean. But it's more than that. The lead is where there's water, the lead's where there's light, and so the lead's where there's life. We see whales going by and seals and birds flying above. It's an incredibly productive area.
Here, Perovich can compare the reflectivity, or albedo, of two very different surfaces, the sea ice and open ocean. His sensor measures the amount of sunlight hitting the ice and the amount it reflects back. Sea ice is the most reflective surface on the planet. It reflects 85% of the sunlight that hits it.
If we were to just go out there, just 100 yards away to the lead, the albedo would be less than 10%. And what's interesting about this is this snow-covered ice has the largest albedo of any naturally occurring surface on Earth. And the open ocean has the smallest. So right here, we have a contrast between the best natural reflector and the worst natural reflector.
Open sea reflects very little light back into space. It absorbs the energy in the sunlight, keeping the planet warm. 650 million years ago, the opposite happened. Earth's best reflector, sea ice, was replacing its worst reflector, sea water. When enough ice had formed, the remaining ocean couldn't absorb enough heat. So more sea ice built up. That reflected more sunlight, the Earth got colder, and that made still more ice. It was the point of no return.
Let's say we grow a little bit more ice. So we're replacing the worst reflector with the best reflector. We'll cool things off, we'll get more ice, and we'll cool it off more, and it builds upon itself.
A runaway freezing effect capable of turning the whole planet into an ice ball. It's an idea no one even considered until a few decades ago. Scientists only discovered it was possible when they were studying another kind of disaster altogether. A nuclear war. During the Cold War, researchers predicted that a nuclear holocaust could push enough smoke and dust into the atmosphere to block out the sun and initiate a global freeze. Russian climate modeler Mikhail Budiko was investigating this scenario when he made a chilling discovery. He calculated that if the ice sheets spread beyond 30 degrees latitude, that's as far south as North Africa, they'd reflect so much of the sun's energy that the Earth would reach an irreversible tipping point.
So when we have a system like the Earth with these feedbacks, one of the things that's talked about a lot is tipping points. You can think of it as you're in a boat rocking back and forth, not much changes until you go too far, and then you're in a new state. And Budiko's work said that if we move the ice down far enough, we'd reach a tipping point and cover the whole Earth with it.
Budiko calculated that if the ice ever reached this tipping point, the planet would no longer absorb enough heat to keep the ice in check. The planet would be entombed in ice from pole to pole. The theory is that 650 million years ago, this was exactly what happened.
Instead of the world we have today, we'd have something that looked like this. A vast expanse of white, of blocks of ice tilted every which way, covered by snow.
The planet descended into the most extreme and least hospitable climate it had ever experienced. Eventually, the ice sheets collided, clamping their icy jaws shut at the equator. It seemed that nothing could survive in this frozen wasteland. And yet, incredibly, it was this catastrophe that brought about life as we know it, and without it, none of this and none of the people around us would be here today.
So tonight what I want you to do is to describe to me how the snowball Earth formed and why. Okay, that's your homework from that video. Let's continue on. Okay, so as a result of the Earth freezing, what happened was the organisms underneath the ice had to compete, and honestly, 98% of all of the bacteria worldwide died. But the ones who survived were competing with each other for whatever resources they could find, and most of them survived around those deep sea vents because there was an energy source and a heat source that kept them alive. Eventually, those organisms, by competing and because of natural selection, started joining together into larger and larger organisms, creating your eukaryotic cells. But it only happened because they were in such competition and such terrible conditions that they had to find a way to survive. And only ones that survived are the ones that seem to do this type of a thing. So anyway, the bacteria started joining together, forming eukaryotic cells. One of the bacteria that he talked about in that video were a bacteria called stromatolites, and these were alive before the ice and after the ice. So these were one of that 2% that actually did survive. Well, if we look at it, what you find in rocks, this is a rock, layers like this. Well, the bacteria are only alive, and they're only alive at the surface. They exude a sticky substance. Sediment from the oceans wash into the sediment and collect in these layers. And so you get layers and layers of sediment, which eventually turns to rock. We have stromatolite rocks that are 300 and 400 meters tall, back from the time before the ice forming. These things, like I said, are they're amazing. They're living rocks. The surface right here, this is a dead one, but the surface right here would be alive. So if you looked out here, all of these are stromatolites. This is in Australia. When the tide comes in, these rocks are just covered up by the water, and it keeps the bacteria alive. And then the tide recedes, and they're exposed to the light and stuff when the tide comes back in. As ocean levels change and become deeper, these stromatolites will die, and hopefully new ones will form in areas where it's shallow enough that they can survive. Which led us to this endosymbiosis theory. Endosymbiosis is the theory that tries to explain how those eukaryotic cells formed. Well, very harsh conditions, a lot of natural selection. What eventually happened is one cell ate another cell, and rather than digest it, they decided to live like they have a brain. They decided to live in harmony together. The two organelles that we know did that are the mitochondria and chloroplast, and there's lots of evidence that points to this. Now, the first thing is that both of those organelles, first of all, resemble living bacteria and cyanobacteria in respect to their DNA and RNA and the way that they do protein synthesis. Okay, so both of them are the only organelles that have their very own DNA and RNA. Second is that they reproduce independent of the eukaryotic cell, and they go through binary fission, just like a bacteria does. Mitochondria have ribosomes, and chloroplasts have ribosomes that are very similar to those found in living bacteria and cyanobacteria. Very different from the ones found in eukaryotes. Eukaryote ribosomes are much larger, have a different protein structure inside them. Also, both of them have membranes on the inside. Now, the chloroplast membrane resembles the membrane found in cyanobacteria, and the mitochondrial membrane resembles some membranes found inside other bacteria. Cyanobacteria are photosynthetic bacteria, and so doesn't it make sense that a chloroplast, which is the photosynthetic organelle, resembles a photosynthetic bacteria? Interesting. Well, life continued. Eventually you got these eukaryotic cells that are starting to grow and things like that. It led to what's called the Cambrian explosion. In the Cambrian period, there was a rapid increase in multicellular organisms. As soon as the eukaryotic organisms formed, they evolved into all sorts of forms, most of which are dead today. But they did evolve into all of the forms we have living today. The animal groups, the plant groups, the fungal groups, and the protist groups. Okay, not that humans evolved, nothing like that. But all of the different major groups evolved during this period. And there's all kinds of living organisms. That led to the next major period called the Ordovician period. We have a rapid development specifically in the marine organisms. We don't have any life on land yet. There were massive glaciers, and at the end of this Ordovician period, there was a major extinction. 75% of all the animal species went extinct because of major environmental changes. That led to the Silurian and Devonian periods. During the Silurian period, you have the first land plants evolving. And we have our first jawless fish. So we have our first fish. So we're finally getting into vertebrates. Okay, before this, everything was an invertebrate. Towards the middle and end of the Silurian, you finally get your land arthropods, specifically insects appearing on land. During the Devonian period, jawed fish appear, and on land you start going from the very simple mosses. Whoops, that's supposed to be moss, not mass. Very simple mosses to some of the club mosses, the horsetails, and ferns. Now, ferns at this time period were very, very tall, kind of like trees. And the insects were, dragonflies with wingspans that were 2 feet across. Just absolutely huge organisms at this period. I mean, insect-wise. They're just very, very large. But at the end of the Devonian, we have another mass extinction. This time, 2 meteorites collided with the Earth, but they don't know if that was just a cause or if that just contributed to it. But 75% of all marine organisms died, and many of the land organisms. So the end of the Devonian was a really tough period. But that led to the Carboniferous and Permian periods. During the Carboniferous, the swamp forests formed, and we used those decayed and became the coal that we use today. So this is the time period. The Earth was very hot and steamy, quite a bit hotter than it is today. And actually there was a lot more oxygen in the atmosphere than there is today. Oxygen levels today are around 20%, 21%. Then it was over 30%, which is actually a little too high, because as soon as lightning splits the sky, it actually causes the oxygen in the atmosphere to burn. Yeah, it's a very dangerous time. But some of the animals that evolved at this time, we have the amphibians forming and ray fin fish forming. During the Permian, we finally developed amniotes, which are things that have an amniote egg, which are the primitive reptiles. Okay? Very primitive reptiles. At the end of the Permian, dramatic climate change caused the oxygen levels to drop from 30 to 15%, so it's a lot lower than it is today. 96% of all life went extinct. A huge extinction rate. Okay, and it happened when all the continents collided. Why is there a 9 there? Causing the volcanoes to erupt. Oh, that's why it was a parenthesis. All the continents collided, forming Pangaea, which changed all of the climate weather patterns and ocean current patterns. And it was catastrophic. The next period is called the Mesozoic, and Triassic is the first part of the Mesozoic period. During this time, the oxygen levels are going to slowly begin to rise. The plants became seed-bearing plants, mainly pine trees. They're naked seeds, though. That's one of the characteristics of pine trees. They don't have fruit or flowers. There is no grass or deciduous trees or anything like that. So if you can imagine, pine trees, and then you're going to have fields of ferns. No grass anywhere. You have turtles and frogs and things like that, crocodiles. The reptiles radiated into the birds and the mammals. Okay, however, at the end of the Cretaceous period, there's another mass extinction. 65% of the Earth species die. Wow, we just have mass extinction after mass extinction. However, we get into the Jurassic period. Some of the reptiles did survive. 35% of the organisms are going to survive. Some of the lizards survived, and eventually those became the dinosaurs. In the middle of this Jurassic period, we have the very first flowering plants, and at the beginning, actually, several mammal species appear. The mammals at this time are very small, rodent-like mammals. And finally, halfway through, like I said, you get grass. Okay. But then came the Cretaceous. And at the end of the Cretaceous, we had a big meteor hit the Earth, and 65% of life went extinct, including all of the dinosaurs. But during this Cretaceous period, you have snakes and a diversification of all the flowering plants and several different groups of mammals. But all animals over 25 kilograms, that's about 12 pounds. Most insects, plankton, and most land plants all went extinct. It was a very bad time. But that leads us to the Cenozoic era, which is the one we're currently in. During this time, the flowering plants dominate the land. We have pine trees and ferns and stuff like that, but mostly what we have are the angiosperms. Humans evolved. We have 4 periods of glaciation. Watch this last show, and then I'll tell you what your homework is for the night.
Hello there. I may look strange to you, but I like to be prepared at all times for whenever the next mass extinction might happen. But I do think it's important to impart this information in a non-muffled way, so I think I'm just going to go ahead and take this off.
That would suck to have to wear that all the time. So you never know when the next mass extinction is going to happen. I mean, there have been 5 of them in the last 450 million years alone. And it's not like a mass extinction is some kind of blurry, ill-defined term. It's when at least 50% of the species on the planet go extinct. One of them, which has been aptly dubbed the Great Dying, wiped out more than 95% of the species on the planet. It's enough to make you walk around with a gas mask. It's possible that the gas mask is excessive. It's also possible that it's useless. I mean, if we get hit by a big meteor, probably not going to help that much. Mass extinction events happen pretty fast on a geological scale, but the actual, dying occurs on our scale quite slowly, tens of thousands of years. And of course, the most important thing to look at here is what these 5 giant mass extinction events had in common so that we can see them coming. Climate change, usually caused by changing CO2 levels and relatively rapid global temperature changes. Yeah, so you see where I'm going with this? I don't mean to alarm anyone here, but the idea that the Earth is currently, as I sit here, going through a 6th mass extinction event is actually not that crazy. Scientifically, it actually might make really good sense. Before we even look at climate change, we already know that humans have been a strange and mysterious and new force for mass extinction. Current extinction rates are somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times what they would be naturally due to humanity's very enterprising nature. And that rate is similar to, or even greater than, the rates of some mass extinction events of the past. So let's forget about all that depressing stuff for a moment and hop into the SciShow time machine. Our first stop, 450 million years in the past, and we're gonna get a little bit wet because pretty much all life on Earth at that time was in the ocean. Welcome, everyone, to the Ordovician-Silurian mass extinction event. Now, you're not going to see any giant comets or meteors falling from the sky, but sometime in the next 10 million years or so, we're going to see 2 really dramatic die-offs, both of them involving the influx of gigantic glaciers and dramatic worldwide falls in sea level. These 2 events will be separated by about 1 million years. Now, it's geologic time, remember, people. And by the end of the second one, 27% of all marine families and 60% of all marine genera were extinct. And I can tell from your blank stares that we're going to require a little bit of a refresher on the biological classification system, which, of course, classifies all life based on common descent, and which we will be talking a lot about as we get more into extinction events. Starting with the most specific, and then getting to the most general, we have species, genus, family, order, class, phylum, kingdom, domain, and good old life. Back to the Ordovician event, what scientists think happened here was that Gondwana, one of the 2 supercontinents at the time, moved into the polar region. This set off a huge drop in temperature, also a huge increase in glacial formation, which dropped sea levels. Marine invertebrates were the hardest hit. 2/3 of all the brachiopod and bryozoan families disappeared. It was also a tough time to be a bivalve or a trilobite. And just because I find this fascinating, there's also another theory about what may have happened to cause the Ordovician event. A gamma ray burst from a hypernova somewhere within 6,000 light years of Earth. A supernova, that's when a star explodes. A hypernova is when a star that's like 100 to 300 times the size of the sun explodes. Even like 10 seconds of a gamma ray burst from a hypernova would completely destroy the ozone layer and dose everything on Earth with a nice, healthy amount of UV radiation. When I say healthy, I mean unhealthy. All right, everybody, back in the time machine. We're going ahead 100 million years to 360 million years ago to the late Devonian extinctions. This is the beginning of a prolonged series of mass extinctions in which half of all genera and 70% of all species will go bye-bye. Marine life will once again be hit very hard, but so will the spiders and the scorpions and the proto-amphibians, which are just taking their first steps out onto land. Narrowing down a time frame for this event has been difficult. Scientists can only say that over a period of 500,000 to 25 million years, that's a big gap there, I know. There were a series of extinction pulses, each lasting about 100,000 years. No gamma ray bursts are suspected here. This is once again being caused by a global drop-off in temperatures. People aren't sure what caused it. Probably either an asteroid impact or a giant supervolcano. Each of those things would have released massive amounts of dust or ash into the atmosphere, drastically changing the climate. Glaciers probably once again inundated Gondwana. What we also know is that ocean levels fell and lost most of their oxygen in the process in what's called ocean anoxia. Some believe that temperatures in the steaming seas of the Devonian fell from 93 to about 78 degrees. Coral reefs were hit so hard that it would be 100 million years before they recovered. But there's another interesting theory here, and that's that plants, which were for the first time really taking hold on land, were absorbing so much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that they actually caused global cooling. So in fact, plants were responsible for that mass extinction event. How could you? And now we will travel to the big one, also known as the Permian-Triassic extinction event, also known as the Great Dying. It is now about 250 million years ago, and a combination of catastrophic events is about to totally alter life on planet Earth. So destructive is this event that it remains the only known mass extinction of insects. This may have been triggered by a comet or asteroid impact, but what scientists feel fairly certain about is that a subsequent volcanic eruption in an area known as the Siberian Traps was responsible for an increase in global temperatures of 5 to 10 degrees. These volcanic eruptions covered an area roughly the size of Western Europe, and they lasted for 1 million years. But then it got worse. The sudden release of gases from methane hydrate reservoirs below the seafloor, possibly caused by underwater volcanic activity, decimated the seas, leading to periods of too much oxygen, called hyperoxia, and too little oxygen, the return of anoxia. And marine life does not fare well in either of these conditions. These two events, at least, possibly others, led to a shift in ocean currents and general inhospitable environment for most of the Earth's species. When the die-off was finally finished, 53% of marine families, 84% of marine genera, 70% of land species, and 95% of marine species were extinct. The Permian extinction had an enormous evolutionary effect, taking place just as mammal-like reptiles like pelycosaurs and therapsids were in their prime. It would be more than 30 million years before these vertebrates and the Earth in general would recover. But it did recover, until 200 million years ago, when the Triassic-Jurassic extinction killed off many early land animals. This includes the death of most of the therapsids, large amphibians, and the archosaurs, paving the way for the age of the dinosaurs. Scientists probably know less about this mass extinction event than any other, but what is known is that 23% of families and 48% of genera went extinct, but what was left fairly untouched were plants and dinosaurs, which now had a lot less competition. This was roughly the time when the massive supercontinent known as Pangaea was breaking apart due to volcanic eruptions. And the massive release of carbon dioxide from those eruptions may have caused some pretty intense global warming. Again, species don't fare well when temperatures increase quickly like this, and it wouldn't be an extinction event without scientists wondering about whether or not there was a massive impact of some kind. But so far, nobody's found any likely crater candidates. But you know where there is evidence of an impact crater? Right off the coast of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. And you've heard of this one. It's where a giant asteroid or comet struck about 65 million years ago, and that kicked off the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction. You know this one. It's the one that killed off all of the non-avian dinosaurs and ushered in the glorious age of mammals and birds. Mammals and birds! The KT extinction, as it's also known, killed off half of all genera and 75% of species. And while the giant asteroid impact winter theory is the leading one, it's by no means the only one. Also happening at the same time, there was a giant volcanic eruption in India that may have caused massive global warming. And that final extinction event brings us back around to today, where 99% of the species that have ever existed on this planet are extinct. But we aren't. We are the 1%. Now, lucky for us, in the history of humanity, we haven't had to deal with any giant comet strikes or super volcanoes, but we do have to deal with a possibly equally destructive force: each other. Some scientists think that we are already in the middle of an event that's moving faster than the KT extinction. But instead of being driven by continents or volcanic eruptions, these extinctions are being caused by rising CO2 levels, habitat destruction, invasive species pollution, and over-harvesting. We already know what changes in global temperature can do to a planet. Click over here for information on that in our climate change video. A normal extinction rate for our planet is about 10 to 25 species per year, and we're already doing about 100 times that. So clearly, the 7 billion of us here on this planet are having a pretty big impact. I guess the question that remains for us to answer is, what are we going to call this 6th mass extinction event? And I would love for you to leave ideas for that in the comments.
Thank you for watching, of course. There's sources for all of our information down in the description, because we are scientists here. We do. It's hard to breathe. We are around if you have questions or suggestions on Facebook, Twitter, and of course in the YouTube comments below. And if you want to continue to be smarter and know more about the world, go to youtube.com/scishow and subscribe. Goodbye.
Okay, for your homework tonight, what I would like you to do is to describe the 5 mass extinctions. Okay? So you have 2 little parts. What happened to cause the snowball Earth, and then to describe the 5 mass extinctions. Have a great night. Bye.